I'm Willrich, a junior and co-executive director of Save the Students. We're so excited to be joined today by a wonderful panel of elected officials.
Thanks, Emily. I'm Leora Soibelman, a sophomore at Gann Academy and founder and co-executive director of Save the Students. Over the next hour, you're going to learn about what our panelists do in government, the political process, and how that work is meaningful in our lives. You'll also be able to engage in Q&A with each of our panelists. One of them is running a little late at the moment.
To start off, could all of our panelists please introduce themselves and briefly describe the role of their position in office?
Hi, everybody. My name is Joe Kennedy. I am your Congressman. I'm the Congressman from the 4th District of Massachusetts. My role is basically two things. One is to make sure that where you and your families have contact with the federal government programs, questions, concerns about laws that are passed, laws that could be passed, and federal government policy, to make sure that my office tries to answer those questions, help for those folks needing services here back in the 4th District of Massachusetts, 34 cities and towns, largely south and west of Boston. And then two is to be your voice for issues and policy that are taking place in the debates down in Washington around federal government policy, laws that are coming up for discussion, debate, and potentially passage. So two basic, two different roles, but essentially trying to be your voice for the federal government.
Good morning. My name is Alice Peisch. I've been the state representative for the 14th Norfolk District, which includes all of Wellesley, all of Weston, and part of Wayland, since 2003. And my role is very similar to what Congressman Kennedy described, only on the state level. So whenever anyone has any issue related to their interaction with state government, whether it is trying to access services or trying to figure out how a particular state law or regulation might apply to their business, then they often will come through my office looking for guidance. And then on the policy side, in the state legislature, we enact all of the laws related to the state of Massachusetts, and certainly I try very hard to be the voice of my district on those matters. For the past 8 years, I have been the House Chair of the Education Committee, so that is an area that I spend an awful lot of time on, and I try to get input on that, not only from people in my district, but also from people across the Commonwealth who are connected to, in any way, public education. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. That's much better. My name is Senator Becca Rausch. I am thrilled to be here with you this morning. I am one of two senators that you have representing the town of Wellesley. I jointly represent this town with our Senate Majority Leader, Cindy Crane. I was just elected in November 2018, sworn in January, so we're coming up on almost 100 days in office, which is very exciting. My role is very similar to the two descriptions we've already heard. I serve as Representative Peisch's partner in the Senate, in our state Senate, addressing state legislative issues. Of course, first and foremost, serving all of the people I represent in my district. My district contains 12 municipalities: Wayland, Needham, Wellesley, Natick, Sherman, Millis, Norfolk, Franklin, Rentham, Plainville, North Attleboro, and the city of Attleboro, all the way down to the Rhode Island border. So it's a really long and skinny district. I do a lot of driving. I'm particularly thrilled to be here with you and for all the opportunities I've had so far, even just in the first 3 months, to speak with young people who are excited about democracy, engaged in democracy, and working to make great things happen. I was particularly honored for the Senate President to appoint me to the Senate's Temporary Committee on Rules. So I worked really hard at the very beginning of the session, not only to file bills and co-sponsor several more, but also to work really closely with a small group of my colleagues to help update the rules that the Senate will operate under for the entire legislative session, and also work on the joint rules that govern the committees that contain both representatives from the House and senators from the Senate. I also serve as the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Municipalities and Regional Government and the Vice Chair of the Joint Committee on Elder Affairs.
Good morning. My name is Mary Strother. I'm not an elected official, but I'm the first Assistant Attorney General, so I work directly with your elected Attorney General, Maura Healey. Maura Healey and our office, we are the chief law enforcement officers for Massachusetts, and our job is to enforce the state laws that are made by some of our lawmakers here today. We call ourselves the People's Law Firm because our job is to represent the people and to protect their rights. We do that in a variety of ways, including protecting consumers, combating fraud and corruption, investigating and prosecuting crimes, protecting the environment, protecting workers, defending civil rights for all people in Massachusetts, including students, and looking after our youth. And specifically in that regard, in 2015, when Maura became the Attorney General, she established something called the Child and Youth Protection Unit in our office, which is specifically purposed with enhancing protections for youth and positive outcomes and making sure every child and youth in Massachusetts is healthy and safe.
Good morning, Wellesley High. How are you guys? Good. My name is Darien Johnson. I am Senator Elizabeth Warren's South Shore Regional Director, so I oversee Wellesley as well. I'm really excited to be here because I want to share with you guys what we do on the official side. Part of my day job is to make sure that I have a great relationship with the electeds, but also I'm making sure that the constituents are being heard throughout the state. And it's a really great job because I get to get the one-on-one interaction with so many constituents and learn so many of the issues that are happening. So I look forward to having a discussion with you guys, and let's have some fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Darren. This is a question for Representatives Kennedy, Peisch, and Senator Rausch. Please describe a rewarding experience you've had when holding your current position. For example, a bill that you worked on that was meant to help a community need and the outcome of that bill.
So the best one that comes to mind, and I guess first off, thank you guys for having us. Thank you for putting this together. I talked with your principal and superintendent, and they said that you guys did all of this, and all they did was say yes. So kudos to your administration for saying yes, and for you guys for doing this. Thank you. The best example that I have is actually probably the first example, because it ended up kind of coming place just as I got elected. But it turns out, as the senator would know, there were facilities down in Attleboro, Massachusetts that used to take part in part of our nuclear weapons programs and our atomic weapons programs a long, long time ago. And before people knew that handling some of those materials were really dangerous and people got really sick. And it turns out a lot of people got really sick, and over years, the US government realized that these materials were very dangerous, and a lot of people started dying from cancer, and not just the people working in those facilities, but oftentimes the contamination was on clothes, so they'd come home and a family member would be washing the clothes and they would get sick. There's a federal program that has set aside a whole bunch of money to try to help people get access to the healthcare that they need, or pay compensation, or if people died, even to try to pay out survivor benefits. But nobody knew that the program actually existed. It had paid out very few, a very low amount of money, particularly for these facilities in Attleboro. Not because people didn't get sick, just because no one knew that there was actually a way to be able to get access to some of those benefits. And it just so happened that there was a front page story on the local newspaper about it the week that I got sworn into office. And the company that ended up taking over those facilities, although they no longer make those materials there, was before coming to testify before me as just by happenstance. And so I was able to ask him some questions and work with the local newspaper and our state and local delegation to try to increase awareness of these programs, and we helped get millions and millions of dollars paid out to families that had lost loved ones or whose parents at that point were sick or struggling, in order to make sure that they were taken care of in a way that they deserved, or if they had passed away, at least the government recognized the service that they had made for our country, and that they got some sort of payout for
Thank you for the question. So I'd just like to talk briefly about a bill that was enacted in the last session related to how teachers in public schools in Massachusetts are able to help English language learners learn English so that they can be more successful in their academic subjects. Many years ago, there was a ballot question that passed that severely restricted the ways in which English learners could be taught English. I think that the genesis of that question was based on some information that showed the Commonwealth was not doing a particularly good job in that area. But the response was, I would argue, to have the pendulum swing from one bad direction all the way to another bad direction, so that for many years, something called sheltered English immersion was the only way in which students new to the country who did not speak English could be taught. And while there is a way to teach that program that can benefit some students, it was not the best program for all students, but it didn't give teachers the flexibility to design programs that would benefit the needs of the students they actually had. So working with then Representative Jeffrey Sanchez from Boston, who had filed this bill for several years, we got it through both the House and the Senate 2 sessions ago, but couldn't get it quite over the finish line. But early in the last session, we were able to get that bill not only enacted but signed by the governor, so that it is now becoming implemented across the Commonwealth and giving teachers in our schools the ability to offer the program that best suits the needs of the students that they are serving. So I think it took too long, but unfortunately the legislative process can be quite lengthy. But I feel very good about the fact that we finally have corrected that problem.
So having only been in office for 3 months, I am looking forward to many experiences while I am holding office that will be hugely successful, but I want to talk about one even in this very early stage of my career that just happened the week before last. The week before last, the Senate held a formal session where we voted on 3 big bills. You might have heard about them in the news. They were covered pretty extensively. The first one was to lift the cap. This is an old, archaic, well, soon will be no longer, hopefully, once the governor signs the bill. But this was a practice from decades ago that capped social service benefits for people already receiving social service benefits if they have another child. So the Senate voted to, the House had already done it, the Senate voted to lift the cap on kids. The Senate also voted to ban conversion therapy for, I always hesitate to use the word therapy associated with this, but that's what it's called, conversion therapy for minors, so people under the age of 18. And we also voted to pass $8 million of supplemental funding to replace the Title X for reproductive health and family planning services that are likely to be withdrawn from a number of healthcare organizations and healthcare providers when the Trump administration's gag rule goes into effect next month, later this month, et cetera. 3 really big bills, 3 really big social justice bills that I care very deeply about. And I'm proud, very proud that the House passed them and they came right to the Senate and the Senate passed them. But I'm particularly proud that we passed all 3 bills with what's called roll call votes. Votes in the Senate and also in the House at the state level in order for a track to be taken of each person in the Senate, each person in the House of Representatives to vote on the record. Someone has to stand up and ask for that, and then a certain number of people have to stand up and support that ask. So I am so proud to have been the person who stood up and asked for that on the $8 million of supplemental funding for reproductive health and family planning services, and to have supported the calls for votes on the record on both of the other bills. So I'm just so proud. It was such a rewarding day overall, and particularly rewarding in those moments where we were voting on the record on those big, important bills.
Thank you. Now we have a short segment
I'll start first. I need a letter for my West Point application. So actually, this is the Senator Warren's office can actually handle this situation. So a lot of times when it comes to nomination time, a lot of high schools will call our office and say, hey, we're looking to apply. How do we get started, or what's the process? Well, we have someone in our office that actually handles that. And what you do is you call our office, you ask us. What I would do from our standpoint is I'll put you in contact with the person in our office. Her name was Abby Glenn. And what she'll do is she'll ask you for all the application materials, and you would pass it to our office. So, one of the things that these are competitive process. It's a competitive process, but what we like to do is make sure that you're prepared to when you're ready to go, go for these types of this opportunity, that you're ready to go. You're ready to go, and you have the things that are necessary. So, this is something that you can call our office, and I can call Congressman as well if you are looking for to go through the nomination process.
I don't think my school gets enough funding for blank department. I'd call Alice. I would call, I think there's probably a couple places you can call, but I would start with your local school board. I would also start with your local delegation. And depending on what that program is, I think you can also call your federal delegation, House and Senate. Representative Peisch knows arguably, and probably not even arguably, better than anybody, the nuances and intricacies of school funding and where the different sources of funding come from and how they do end up down into local schools and programs like yours. And so depending on which program that is, where she could best advocate for how to make sure that that funding gets incremented, or increased. And absent that, my first call would be to call the representative to have her tell me where I should look.
Well, thank you. And so this says, I have issues with student loans, so I think I'd probably tell you to call Joe. That's a little bit of a short answer, but for the most part, student loans are through a federal program, and so therefore I would recommend that you call Congressman Kennedy's office. I have a very good working relationship with his staff, and both offices frequently get calls that really should be going to the other, which to me underscores the need for, I may have debated about mentioning this bill earlier. We recently enacted some legislation in Massachusetts that hopefully will result in better civics education for our residents so that they will know the difference between the state and the federal government, which I'm always, certainly no one who graduated from Wellesley High School has this problem. But I'm looking around and seeing your teachers, and my children all graduated from this high school, and I know that you all know the difference between state and federal government. But I'm amazed at the number of people who do not. I'm often asked where my Washington office is. But in any event, the student loans is primarily a federal obligation program. I would probably refer you to a member of my staff who might ask you a few more questions about exactly what the problem is to make sure it isn't through some other program that the state does have a few programs relative to student financial aid, and then we would refer you to whomever was the appropriate person. So thank you for that question.
I want to buy a big fancy American flag. And my first thought was, did you try Amazon? So I probably would also have my outreach director call the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office and see if there's anything we need to know about purchasing a flag in particular. I might also refer them to Alice or any of the other state reps with whom I work. But I'm pretty sure that you can buy a flag from a variety of places outside of our offices. But then I might also say, well, what do you want to use it for? If it's just to put outside your house, then by all means, go forth and wish you all the best. If it's something that is perhaps a community event or something with local government or something involving state government, then my outreach director would probably get a little more involved and see if we could be helpful in any way.
You can also do that by putting in a request to your senator or your congressman, and we are happy to provide you with a flag. I think it's $35, if I remember correctly. But we are happy to do that.
I just learned something.
Well, I got a great question for the Attorney General's office. My employer is not following workplace laws. Guess what? Our job is to make sure employers are following workplace laws. So the first thing I would do is I would grab the handy sheet that I've left at the back of the room for folks about all the numbers you can call at the Attorney General's office to get help with student loans or fair labor questions. We have a fair labor division which has a designated person answering the phone who will take the information, tell you what your rights are, whether you are an adult or under the age of 18, which means you have special rights. Then your employer cannot require you to work a certain number of hours and after a certain time of day or night. And so you should know when you get your first job what those rights are, because they are often abused by employers. So that's what I would do. Call our office and talk to our Fair Labor Division, find out what your rights are, explain the problem, and we will investigate.
So now we have Q&A. So please just keep all questions kind of short to the point. Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
Mike's in either aisle.
Hello? Okay. So why do you think that children who are homeschooled consistently score better on things like the ACT rather than students in public education?
I'd be interested in knowing the source of that statistic. Is that a Commonwealth of Massachusetts statistic? Is that a national statistic? Because the information that Massachusetts does not have a huge number of students that are homeschooled, but I have not seen that data.
I do believe that it was a national statistic, so it may well be the case that students perform worse here than they would in other districts, but yeah.
I mean, I certainly am a strong proponent for very good, high-quality public education. Massachusetts happens to have the best public education in the country and compares very favorably globally. Now, having said that, we still have some places where the education is not at the same level of quality that you have here in Wellesley and the surrounding communities, and that is one of the areas that we focus on in state policy, is trying to bring every school in the Commonwealth up to these standards so that every child is able to get a high-quality education. And people access homeschooling for a whole variety of reasons. Sometimes it is because the parents feel that the quality in their local schools is not strong enough. Other times it has to do with a variety of other personal issues. So I think it's hard to generalize about homeschooling depending upon the particular circumstances of the individual child.
Thank you.
This is a question for Congressman Kennedy. In terms of banking regulation, what is the line between protecting consumers and depositors and disincentivizing economic growth?
It's a great question. Where's the line? Look, I don't think you need to necessarily draw one to say that it's in either or circumstance. And with regards to banking policy writ large, this gets complicated pretty quick, and candidly, not the committee on which I sit. But I would say part of the goal of federal policy, laws that are passed, and then enabling regulators to set those rules, is to try to make sure that we actually stimulate economic growth, but recognize that economic growth, at least in my mind, not all economic growth is exactly the same. And we want to make sure that small businesses, families, individuals have access to credit that they need in order to start those businesses, to be able to flourish and meet their own economic needs, without putting them on undue risk where if something goes wrong, they're going to lose everything. And I think there's a way to calibrate that, those regulations on a wide variety of different financial products to make sure that you are providing access to liquidity, access to credit, access to capital, without then putting people on facing a downside risk of losing everything if things turn a little bit. I would also, I don't want to put anybody here on the spot, but I know the Attorney General's office does an awful lot of this from state policy and has been an extremely active proponent at trying to make sure that with financial products that are out there, that they do treat people fairly. I don't want to put you on the spot here, but if you had anything else to add.
Well, that's right. We do have an insurance fraud unit that investigates when lenders, banks, or other financial institutions are violating our state laws. We have an obligation to protect consumers and make sure that they're receiving all the information and all the disclosures that they're entitled to. And we have a law called 93A in Massachusetts, which is the law that protects consumers from fraud, waste, and abuse. And we use that to conduct investigations and, if necessary, bring complaints against institutions that we don't think are treating consumers fairly.
Thank you.
Hi, this is a question for everyone. So coming from Wellesley, we have the opportunity of an amazing education. However, many districts in Massachusetts, for example, Dorchester doesn't have the same, Roxbury doesn't have the same advantages. So how is Massachusetts working to fix the learning gap between districts and schools in relation to funding?
So I'll start with that. Massachusetts, back in 1993, passed a law that's referred to as the Education Reform Act, which did two things. The goal of that law was to ensure that there was a basic standard to which every school in the Commonwealth had to, a basic standard that every school in the Commonwealth had to meet with respect to academic courses to help recognizing that in order to do that, all schools needed a certain amount of resources. That bill created something called the foundation budget, which established a baseline for how much it would cost to deliver that, or it was an estimate of how much it would cost to deliver that education. And then the third component of the bill was state assessments that you all know as the MCAS, which are designed to ensure that the schools are meeting those standards. As a result of that legislation, as I said earlier, Massachusetts went from being sort of middle of the pack, high middle of the pack, to the top of the pack with respect to overall performance. But we have consistently had a very large and persistent gap between high-performing and lower-performing schools. I was the co-chair of a commission that looked at the funding a couple of years ago to try to identify where there are areas where we needed to increase the funding. We made 4 recommendations. I'm currently working on legislation with my Senate counterpart, Senator Lewis, to hopefully come up with a plan to implement all of those recommendations later. The plan we hope to have within the next few months. We've started to implement some of the recommendations. I think what's really critical is ensuring that the resources that the state and the communities are devoting to the schools are actually spent in a way that benefits those students. Unfortunately, from time to time, we do hear too many accounts of situations where there may be a fair amount of money being spent, yet the gaps are still there. So we do have information relative to the kinds of programs that, if done well, will ensure that all students are offered the kind of education that you get here in Wellesley. I have to say, one of the frustrations that I have had over the years is hearing people say to me, well, you know, these children, they are not like the children in your district. They have too many problems, and there's nothing the schools can do about that. We have seen extraordinary performance in some districts that serve students that come from extremely limited resources. So I think that excuse is not a valid one, and we have to really hold everyone's feet to the fire and make it very clear that we expect all students to be given a high-quality education. Thank you for the question.
I just want to piggyback on what Representative Peisch just said. Part of our job, of course, is to know about all of the bills that are going on, particularly in the education space, in sitting before the Education Committee and also the Higher Education Committee as a state that has a significant number of higher education institutions, but also to really learn about and know the lived experiences in our districts, right? So you heard me say earlier that I represent Wayland and Wellesley and Needham and Natick. I also represent Attleboro and North Attleboro and communities much farther to the south. And in my district, there is a very distinct difference between the opportunities that you all have here and the opportunities that other children have in other parts of my district. And so part of what I consider to be my job is being a voice in the state senate and through our legislative process for all of those lived experiences. I represent a district that has a regional school, and regional school transportation, for example, is a big expense, and that fund, that the question of that funding is not part of the bill, the Promise Act and the deliberations that Representative Peisch and Senator Lewis are managing now in the Education Committee. That's part of the budget. So we need to make sure that we as legislators are first listening, and then taking those lived realities and turning those experiences into voice and advocacy on Beacon Hill to ensure that all of our students, whatever your zip code, in Massachusetts have access to a high-quality public education.
Thank you.
I actually want to piggyback off this question because I think it's really important. I know we talked about state funding and make sure we have appropriate resources, but I want to talk about a standpoint of opportunity. I'm actually from Dorchester, Massachusetts, so I think it's close to me that you brought this question up. And one of the things that every day I go to work is I remember why I wanted to work in politics was to be a public servant and to serve people. And what I always take my story, and one of the things that I can do is make sure that the next person that wants an opportunity in politics can also get that. Because I think part of it's not yes, sometimes it is about proper funding it, but it also is too. It's about the resources that you actually do have and making sure someone else gets it. And there's a lot of power to that. And I know that there's interns that came to our office that were from the school that came, and one of the things that I did was spend a lot of time with them and talk about some of the things that they might not have seen, because I think everybody here has a different experience, and everybody has one thing about the South Shore is that it's a tight-knit community, and what I would say to that is you do have power in where you're from, and also making sure that people are aware of the opportunities that are out there too, because at the end of the day, being on this this panel as well as I'm also letting you guys know there is a high school internship, and we do offer that, and that that opens your horizon. So I just want to say as well is that remember you also do have power, and it's your voice, and also letting those that might not know of the opportunities that you have to make sure that they're aware of it. So I just want to let you guys know that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So this question is going to everybody at the panel. So me and a group of students are working with Sustainable Wellesley. It's a community partnership project to help reduce water bottle use at Wellesley High School. And so if we were going to take that to the next step and try to ban one-use plastic water bottles in Wellesley and like a whole, like would that be possible? And like if so, like what's like first steps would we take to like start that process?
Kudos, good job. So there's at least one bill that I know of at the state level about single-use plastic water bottles. There's also the plastic bag bill that was heard, was that last week? Last week, so so I just want you to know if you're not alone, right? So there are a lot of people talking about these issues. For Wellesley to do that, by all means, you're welcome to call my office, and we're happy to help you. I presume Representative Peisch would say the same thing. But you'd put together, you'd be working with your local government to do that, and we'd be happy to either connect you with them or try to help you steer the process. But you'd have to basically write a local version of a bill and get a bunch of signatures of registered voters and get that to go before town meeting and try to get it passed that way. You could also talk to the Board of Selectmen and see if they want to take it up as an initiative. So there are a couple of different ways that you might do that at the local level, and that's awesome. You might also think about talking to your state legislative delegation or any of the environmental organizations that are advocating really hard to promote positive changes for our environment as opposed to other options, and try to work something across the Commonwealth as well.
So I would just like to also suggest that I think that starting things small and building on them is always has a positive value to it. If for nothing else, you sort of encounter what the obstacles may be and the pluses and minuses. So you may already have done this, but I would suggest working right within the high school. See what you can do about eliminating these right here. And then, maybe working with the Student Congress, the people who are providing the food services, and then talking to your local school committee about what policies they might be willing to enact.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Manny Bernardo. I'm a senior at the high school. This question was touched upon a little bit by Sadna previously, and touching base on the achievement gap between different schools, largely derived from the varying differences in financial resources. But I actually wanted to focus that question a little bit more on the individual level when it comes to individual localities and the achievement gap between different demographics within the school. Recently, there was a report that was released, a district report for the town of Wellesley, I believe, that had stated that certain demographics in the school, racial demographics, I think it's stated blacks and African Americans and underprivileged students were generally lagging behind historically and up until now behind their other students. And I was wondering whether that responsibility of closing the achievement gap laid within the local, the state, or the governmental level, and how students can participate in those types of legislative decisions.
So I think you raise a very important issue. There is I think, erroneous assumption that this gap exists only between, let us say, schools and students in districts that do not have a lot of resources and communities like Wellesley. But the data, you're absolutely right, shows that in virtually every community there is a significant gap among certain demographics. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to focus on closing that gap. So it's not just the state level, we have to do it starting at the individual schools. And I know that this is something that the school administration is aware of and has been trying to work on, but I think as students you are in a unique position to be able to communicate with the administration about what you actually see as the barriers to better student performance in the classrooms. And I suspect that those of you who are actually in those classrooms have something to offer, so I would encourage you to do that.
Just very quickly, I assume everybody up here agrees, it's all of our responsibility. There's some of that can be more specifically tailored to the individual needs of a community like yours or our region by working with your state and local delegation, whether that's, again, town committees, school board, state legislators. But the point that you just made, Manny, exists around the country, and it's awfully hard from my perspective to say how you're going to address that structural change without looking at federal policy and not just the law and incentives around it, but also funding, financing, and investment. And so the federal government has a lot more money to invest than the state government can. So there's a lot to that, but without question, I think everybody here tries to address those structural issues with the opportunities and responsibilities that every one of our offices have. I know Senator Warren's been one of the leading champions of this on a whole bunch of different policies in the Senate. The Attorney General, you're not going to find a more active and engaged Attorney General addressing those structures than anywhere in the United States. And certainly your state delegation, you've heard from them already about that. So all of us.
So essentially the answer is yes. All of those different things. All of the different partners that you work with from your classrooms and your teachers, and I know some of your faculty here are specifically dedicated to this, to local government, state government, federal government, et cetera. And part of what you can do is make sure that the information is flowing between all of those different branches, right? We all work together, obviously, and there are a lot of things that we work on. So if this is something that you want to really focus on, you can try to make sure that you are connecting the dots with the stories that you're hearing and the work that you're doing. There might be something that Wellesley High, for example, is doing to reduce racial disparities in education that other schools throughout my district, throughout the Commonwealth, might be able to use as a model. So that's something you specifically, right, as agents of change, all sitting in this room, can work on.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your great questions. In the interest of time, we just have more questions, so you can go.
I apologize for the general nature of this question because I recognize that it's sort of a complicated issue. But how does the panel feel in general about socialism within the government and socialism versus capitalism?
So I'll start. One, I think, let me try to kind of refine that question a little bit. I think, so I believe in our capitalist system 100%. I think what you see in our system, though, is areas where, getting back to the very first or second question we had around risk and regulation, there's some places where we have set up a system where you have socialized loss, so we all bear the cost when something doesn't work, and privatized gain, so very few folks get the reward when it does. And I think that's one of the big areas of government that we're trying to, that I believe we need to reevaluate. But we already, our government does an awful lot of additional ways of trying to build up and protect a collective good, whether that's through some existing programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, whether that's through Defense Department and the collective defense, where we already make investments there that are shared and shared contributions in and shared reward back. The question I think, though, gets to on some of the larger structural aspects of our capitalist system where you see individuals gaining an awful lot, but where because of work or investment or whatever else that they put in, great, but if that risk of loss is then borne on everybody else, those incentives aren't necessarily calibrated in my mind the proper way to merit that out, if that makes sense. So I would do more of it, but I think that there's already an awful lot of it that's done. I'd be specific about what it is, the areas where we need to reform and the goals on it. And from my perspective, the goal should be to be able to empower every single American family to meet the financial needs for their own future, care for their kids, invest in their retirement, and have some semblance of economic safety and security. And I don't think we're there yet.
So I think Congressman Kennedy did a very good job of answering that question. I would say that I agree with virtually everything he said. I think that essentially we have, as a country, been very successful overall with the capitalist system. But I think if you talk to most economists, they would say that capitalism works, but it does have to have some regulation. And to the extent that there have been some regulations that we have backed away from over the past few decades, I think they have led to some inequities that we need to now address. I would not be supportive of going all the way to a totally socialist system. I think one of the things that you discover, if you don't know it before you get into elected office, is that you go back to the what was this country founded upon? The Boston Tea Party, and we were revolting against, quote, taxation without representation. And as a result, there is, through our history, a very a suspicious attitude towards taxes. If you look at the countries that are completely socialist there, the rate of taxation is something that I don't think we could ever achieve here. So, and I don't think it's necessary to get the same benefits to our citizens. I think we really do need to just focus on those areas where maybe we have either rolled back some regulations or not invested sufficiently in the programs that are of tremendous benefit to all of the citizens.
So I'll just add, or lift up the sentiment about being issue-specific with regard to this. It is, as you mentioned in your question, it is a really broad question. So, you know, specifically, I'm a former healthcare attorney, so I care a lot about healthcare and healthcare delivery and healthcare access and healthcare quality. So, you know, anyone who's ever argued with an insurance company knows that, and if you yourselves haven't, probably your parents have, and grandparents and aunts and uncles and all other adults that you know. We don't really have a truly, fully universal access to healthcare yet. Right, so that's something that I care very deeply about, that I'm working on. It's one of my, you know, legislative focal points. So to the extent that you can be specific about which things you want to make progress on in terms of issues, I think that'll probably help you in this broader conversation as you go forward. And I also just want to say, if anyone has, I know there were lots of people at the microphones, and I'm sorry that we're out of time. I'm happy to answer more questions. You can send them to me by email. I presume all of us up here would say the same thing. You know, you can easily find my email, or you can tweet at me, Becca Rausch, MA, and I'll try to answer your questions. The tweets I actually see pretty quickly. So, or you can just assemble a list and send it out, and we'll try to, you know, respond to all of your questions.
Thank you for those great audience questions. I just have one final question for all the panelists. What is something you want your constituents to know about the role of government in their lives?
Coming into working for the Senator, I never even knew that, from a government perspective, that we had resources such as to help with Social Security issues, Medicare issues, veterans issues, even housing and banking issues as well with the CFPB. So I think the question, I guess something that I didn't know was that there are resources out there for to help families, to help constituents that are in need. And this is my call for you guys, is that if you ever feel like there's an issue that you're dealing with, you know, call our office. It's so important that, not even just for the fact that, you know, you have an issue, but to know that our office is there for you. Look, we might not have the answers, but I always say this, and this is something that is like a motto in our office, is that we know somebody that can. So I would say the government is here to help you. There is resources available. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone and call, because there's somebody there who wants to help you. So thank you.
I guess the main point that I would tell you is that it's your government, so shape it, engage with it. And if it's not doing something that you wish it would do, then go out there and try to make sure we change it. You've got, for your assembly today, you've got your representatives from your state rep's office, state senate office, House of Representatives office, Senate office, and the Attorney General's office. You did a pretty good job getting us here, right, which is impressive given the demands on everybody's calendar, but you made that happen. And so if there's things out there that we're not doing, then ask us, and if we say we can't, then find a way to do it. And if there's things there that chances are there are resources or people that we can point you to, whether it's water bottles here at school or across the town or across the Commonwealth. But the challenges that we are confronting, and they're significant at least from my perspective, at a federal level, we're either going to solve them or we're not. And you can either have a voice in solving them, in which case that solution will look much more like the ones you want, or we won't, in which case they're going to be your challenge to carry on for yet another generation. And so one way or another, the choices that your government makes now are going to have a direct impact on your lives in a large and meaningful way. And you can either choose to lean into that and help shape it and do it the way that you craft it the way that you want to see it, or let somebody else do it for you. And there's no guarantee that that person's going to be better at it than you would be. So go get it.
So I would echo the comments that have already been made here, both that the government does provide an awful lot of resources that can be of help to you in many, many different situations, but also, and I think most importantly, This is your government. We are all here because if you're not 18 yet, this will apply to you shortly, but if you are, we're here because you and others voted for us, and you and others are capable of voting for other people if you think we are not doing the job that you would like to see. But we also are very dependent upon our constituents to communicate with us and to let us know what are your concerns. Are we doing it right? Are we not? Is there something that you would like to see us address that we are not addressing? I'm always somewhat surprised at what I would say the relatively small number of people that I actually hear from. There are a lot of organized organizations that communicate with my office, and I'm sure with my colleagues' offices, but the number of individual residents of the community that take the time to send an email that they've drafted, not one that someone sort of told you to press this button and they'll send it for you. There are very few of those people, so you can have a real, but I pay attention to them, and I'm sure my colleagues pay attention to the people they hear from. So I strongly encourage you, if you are at all interested in government, and if you're not, I encourage you to think about why and get involved, because as Congressman Kennedy said, the solutions to these problems are a function of what the people ultimately express and want us to do. So I strongly encourage you to participate, and I take from the fact that you are here and engaged that you will be doing that. So thank you.
So everything that has already been said, but the question is, what do we want you to know about the role of government in your life, in all of your lives? And at bottom, I am hard pressed to think of anything that happens in my life, or I mean, I don't presume to know everything that's going on in all of your lives, but generally speaking, I'm hard pressed to think of something that happens in day-to-day life that government doesn't touch in some way, particularly local government, right? You've heard the phrase probably before, all politics is local. It's really true. And that's not something that I think many people know, right? But this is, right, you have one of your two state senators and your state rep, your congressman, your senator office, you have a whole panel of people here. And each of us have related but different roles. But the people we don't have up here are a member of your Board of Selectmen or some of your town meeting members. And town meeting is happening right now, right? They're in the middle of session right now. And that's where your local issues are addressed. That's where your local tax dollars are spent, right? That's where your local budget happens. And what I think is amazing is that, this is a room, I think there's over 100 of you here today. Is that right, roughly? Yeah, over 100 young people here to hear and learn and be engaged. And that is phenomenal. So I look out at all of you and I see just a tremendous amount of potential of power. If there's something that you all come together about and say, we got to get this done, you're going to make headway on it, for sure. And there isn't, I promise you, you're also going to be hard-pressed to think of anything that's going on in your life that government doesn't touch in some way and that some level of government couldn't help to make better. So I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Well, first, thank you for all coming out and being engaged today. If you're 18, please, and when you turn 18, please register to vote. But before that, don't underestimate your power to make change, big and small, in your community and nationally. I think about the March for Our Lives that was organized by students just like you across the nation and marched up to the State House. It makes a difference when the folks here in this, at this table hear from you and what matters to you. And I'll give you a small example. In a neighboring high school to this one, a call came in from a student who was looking at her homework app and noticed that on the banner there was an e-cigarette ad. And she called the Attorney General's office and said, is it okay for e-cigarette companies to be marketing their vaping products to high school and middle school students who use this app? And we said, no, it is not okay Thank you for telling us about it. We contacted the e-cigarette company. We determined that they were not using any age verification to sell vaping products in Massachusetts, which is against the law. And we told them that they were breaking the law and they were no longer allowed to sell vaping products in Massachusetts until they could prove to us that they were conforming with our laws. One student, one call, shut down an e-cigarette company in Massachusetts. So you can make a difference with one call.
Thank you so much for coming to get one thing from this past hour, I think all of us pretty much said it. It's your government work for you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.